Welcome everybody. I'm super excited to welcome you and welcome Professor Elicia Maine to UBC.
Thank you.
And I already know that you know many people around, so as you notice, this is a very familiar gathering. And we're really looking forward to listening to your talk related to accelerating advanced material innovation. And if you click once, I will show a little bit what we have today as a plan. I'm supposed to talk for 3 minutes. Please stop me in 3 minutes. Then we have, at the end, questions and answers. So that will be very nice. And one note is that if you don't need to take notes, so Elicia kindly will distribute the PDF of the presentation today, so you don't need to take notes, if that helps. And then, before we start, maybe to acknowledge, we would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So, and then very briefly about Elicia, you can see a little bit here about her background. She comes from Simon Fraser University, and I understand she really has interface with many faculty and students in UBC. But what she does is really advancing a mission that is so important in the university system. And I think we need to improve what we do. And this is very relevant for BioProducts Institute, where we're generating many ideas, but we don't know how to channel those ideas into, an impact, a real impact. And you can read there a little bit about her background. So I think, of course, we are super humbled to have you here and to learn from your experience. And you're warmly welcome. And then the floor is yours, Elicia.
Thank you so much, Orlando. And thank you for coming to join us here today. There are, as Orlando mentioned, there are some familiar faces here, and thank you for coming. And also a lot of new faces. So delighted to talk to you about this topic and to interact in discussion at the end. I don't know if we'll precisely meet those to the minutes agendas, but we will be generally in that direction. So I wanted to start off by telling you I'm a very interdisciplinary scholar, and for some of you, my research will be outside of the realm of what you normally think about within engineering or within your field. So I want to tell you a little bit about the professors who influenced my research path, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research piece streams that I've done before I get deeply into this topic about accelerating advanced materials innovation. So up here on the slide, you'll see the people that are materials engineers. Professor Mike Ashby of the Ashby Materials Selector and Engineering Selector, and Professor Joel Clark. Professor Ashby was one of my 2 supervisors for my PhD at the University of Cambridge, along with Dr. Elizabeth Garnsey, who was over in the Institute for Manufacturing and Enterprise. And Professor Joel Clark was my key supervisor for my master's degree, which was interdisciplinary. It was technology and policy, but he was the materials systems laboratory chair. And everybody here who influenced me is an interdisciplinary scholar. And everybody, barring Fiona Murray, who is from the Sloan School of Management at MIT and is now one of 2 deans for innovation across MIT, everybody else here comes out of an engineering faculty. So they all are looking at questions of how do you make impact from your research, and how does it happen in practice? In materials, saying there's 50,000 materials that have been developed. When you develop a new one, how do you know in advance that it's worth pursuing? How do others know that it's worth pursuing? How do you communicate to designers? How do you tell if that novel material is viable, which I'll come back to in the talk? Then Professor Jim Utterback wrote a classic book, Mastering the Dynamics of Innovation. He looks at the emergence of new industries and how they happen and what kind of innovation management patterns are common that you see in the emergence of new industries, which is relevant, of course, to bioplastics. Professor Elizabeth Garnsey has looked over her career at the emergence of firms from universities. Welcome. And looking at how their different paths have happened and case study research interacting that. And similarly, Dr. Kathy Eisenhart, who is in the engineering faculty but the management science at Stanford, has done very beautiful multi-level work that again is case study and qualitative, but works on multiple levels to look at strategy and technology strategy and innovation questions. And lastly, up here, Professor Fiona Murray, one of the things that I've followed in her career has been that she also had a PhD in science. I have a PhD in materials engineering along with my interdisciplinary degrees, and she had a PhD in biochemistry and decided to publish on both sides of the chasms, if you will. So she published not only in the innovation management and strategy journals, but also in Nature Biotechnology in her case. And so that was the cue for me to think about publishing my research in places where the people I wanted to influence could read it. So this interdisciplinary flavor goes right back to my PhD. On the left-hand side there is the document from my PhD that I submitted in 2000 that is called very boldly Innovation and Adoption of Materials, very broad. And then to the right is the workbook that I developed along with my supervisor and another collaborator at the Institute for Manufacturing from my thesis to enable it to be knowledge in practice, to enable us, both researchers as well as companies, consultants, investors, to try to use some of the work that I did in my thesis. And I think this document might be useful for some of you who are looking at the first questions of how to think about viability of novel material that you're involved with researching. I've done a lot more scholarly work, of course, in the process of becoming a full professor. And in my case, I joined a business school where I could have joined an engineering school, but in the business schools, there was more room for me to do the interdisciplinary work that I wanted. And specifically at Simon Fraser University, when I was making these decisions in 2000, they had just started the Management of Technology MBA program. And that was for scientists, but out of the Faculty of Business. And they also agreed to let me do research that crossed those bridges. So I started to write in the in the social sciences literature, in the innovation management literature, but I always wrote about the context of advanced materials and later about science innovation as I was able to more clearly outline the boundary conditions and start to advance that research. So the one at the top is one that's from my PhD thesis, and Elizabeth Garnsey, one of my supervisors, was a co-author that looked at, again, 2 case studies of advanced materials ventures spinning out of universities and long-term science-based innovation, but also looking at the whole system in which this happened, and the phenomenon, which you'll hear again in this talk about, of technology market matching. So I'll come back to technology market matching. I've also looked at how innovation happens in large multinational firms, and it's often through having a small incubated venture internal to that organization, but that has different incentives and different resourcing and different time periods and different risk tolerance than the much larger company. The piece that I want to focus on for our talk today is a piece that I published in Nature Materials, again following the sort of career choices of Professor Fiona Murray. But I published it there with a venture capitalist, actually. So I'd done, at this point, 15 years of research on advanced materials ventures and on the ways that they tried to commercialize research. And I was part of this international symposium with large multinational firms. Usually they're sort of VP level, a VP, sometimes a CEO level of the large multinational firms who were thinking about the strategic questions of how to get value from novel materials that are being commercialized at other R&D facilities and through their partners. And so this venture capitalist and he also had a PhD in materials engineering and 30 years of investment experience, decided we would summarize the literature and give some case study examples of how you could actually accelerate advanced materials commercialization, how you could be more systematic about it and give yourself a better chance of success, what was actually challenging, and what you could do at early stages to make that more rewarding for the researcher and more profitable for the company or investment, as well as get things that are important out in the world. More recently, actually last month, we published a paper in Nature Nanotechnology that was looking at the entrepreneurial capabilities of scientists in that process when they're still in the research lab. And so I'll come back to that later on in the talk. So enough about the background. I'm going to give you a couple of social sciences definitions that you can think about as you think about your own research. And one of these, I don't think it's tracking. That's okay. I'm going to try it again. There's a special code here. There. Good. So one of these definitions is radical innovation. And a radical innovation or a radical invention is something that is an entirely new attribute that didn't exist before. Or if it did exist before, then it's something where you've had a very large improvement in properties. We're not talking 20%, we're talking like 10 times new improvement in a known property. Or it can be a very significant reduction in cost. And here we're thinking about 30 to 50% or more reduction in cost. So that is a radical technology, a radical invention, and could become a radical innovation. So the differentiator, it's not incremental. It's not a small change. And in many of your cases, you could have a totally new attribute when you're thinking about being fully compostable, or you're thinking about all of the environmental factors associated with novel materials. Another term I want you to walk away with is that of generic technology, which is especially important in advanced materials. And so a generic technology is something that enables applications across several sectors of the economy. So where radical is deep change, we've done something really that is changing the game in terms of attributes. Generic is broad. So it's saying we're changing this in sporting goods, we're changing this in building materials, we're changing this in packaging, we're changing this in biomedical applications, right? A huge swath of potential value creation across many, many different segments. And you'll also hear terms like general purpose technology for that. And you'll hear terms like a platform technology, but a platform technology usually means across one industry, right? So in biotech, you might have a platform technology. Generic, which is the case with bioplastics, can be across several different sectors. And the question I asked myself when I started researching in a faculty of business and in social sciences research was, how can something, an invention in a research lab, be radical, be generic, so it's enabling entirely new attributes or something that's 10 times better than what exists before, has relevance across a huge swath of the economy? How can that not be attractive for investment? And I imagine that many of you have underlying and implicitly that same assumption that it would be. It's got a breakthrough invention, it's got applications across wide sectors. Of course, I'm building a better mousetrap, they're going to come running to my door. And actually, the answers are that because these inventions in advanced materials in particular, but in science-based fields, because they have prolonged technical and market uncertainty, because they take big investments in commercialization cost before those uncertainties are resolved, and because this happens over a long period of time, that's why it can be both radical and generic, and nobody's beating a path to your door. You're not getting the right alliance partners. You're not having large industrial players commercialize that. You're not having investors. And so how do we tackle that? How do we accelerate advanced materials commercialization? Well, let's look at the different parts. So this was from the Nature Materials review paper. And remember, it's from a venture capitalist perspective as well as 15 years of academic research. And it's saying, okay, well, let's look at the comparison of IT, or, to be in a real extreme, let's say you developed a new app. So you've got a new app, how long did it take you? Maybe 6 months? Did you do it, out of, in your living room? Maybe, let's say generously that it's costing you a couple of $1 million in R&D. Commercialization, there is some cost there in the marketing and in trying to get right partnerships to have that app developed. But at no time would you ever say, I don't think I can create this app. So that the technical uncertainty is really low. And there is some market uncertainty, depends on who else has other apps that are going to be creating more value or who gets locked into different networks. In stark contrast, in science-based ventures, advanced materials, and in biomed, I'm going to give an example of clinical biomed, therapeutic development, for example. You're talking somewhere in the order of 5 to 15 years from that aha moment in the research lab to when you first get dollars in for that in terms of revenue, and when you first have implemented that innovation in practice. R&D costs are in the order of several million, and sometimes higher, but what's real killer is when you're in these commercialization costs. And remember, these are before the uncertainty is resolved. And so you're ending up in biomed, you've got very high uncertainty. You think about new drug developments, and the chance of actually being successful through each of your clinical trials is very, very low. It can be about $1 billion to get through those trials successfully. And you still have some market uncertainty. In advanced materials, you have, at least in biomed, you have a systematic reduction in risk, because if you pass phase 1, if you pass phase 2, your risk goes down, and investors know that, and that changes it. In advanced materials, the analogy would be that you need to prove scale up. So you need to have a pilot scale up facility, and that may cost you, $100 million to have that scale up facility that you need to have, and you have to have it before you know all the answers, before your technological or market risks are fully reduced. So that's the answer to that vexing question about how can something be breakthrough, relevant to many different sectors, and not necessarily attractive to investors or to alliance partners, and getting out into the world. Now, the other little wrinkle to this that is also part of my research and relevant to all of you here is that university spin-offs are increasingly playing the lead role in actually getting those radical generic inventions out into the world. And this is because many of you have noticed that large multinational firms are doing less R&D, and they're certainly doing less breakthrough R&D. You think about, Bell Labs, you think about, Xerox PARC, you think about Dow and DuPont and large players that used to do much more breakthrough research. Over the last 20 years, that has decreased hugely, and it's done for two reasons. One has been the way that executives are compensated, and how there's short-termism in the decisions that are made about what happens inside the company in cost centers versus what gets bought externally in acquiring a venture. And the second thing has been the idea of open innovation, which is that we're just going to wait until a small venture de-risks this, and then we're going to acquire them. And that sort of partnership between large and small companies, which we've seen for decades in the pharmaceutical and biomed sector, that's also happening in advanced materials. And so the fact that the small venture and the university spinoff is playing a lead role means that you, that are trying to create impact from your research, need to have a little bit more of a lens of how you can get your research out in the world and what the challenges are that maybe used to be happening within that large research facility. It's more important that it happens within the minds of the people that are creating those inventions in the universities. So I'm going to give you two different, again, pieces of terminology that are specific to the challenges faced by advanced materials ventures and novel materials getting out in the world. One is that they frequently have uncertainty involved in the fact that it's process innovation. That is a big part of the novelty rather than product innovation. So it's how you make the product is actually a critical part of the secret sauce and is part of the scale-up challenges. So process innovation have a different set of challenges than product innovation. And they also end up inducing more uncertainty for the partners that you have to work with, right? Because you're changing their processes, and that it brings in risk for them. And the second is the idea of being upstream or downstream in the value chains. And I'm going to explain that in just a moment. So for process innovation, here's an example of a study I did with an MBA student who was at SFU, but looking at a researcher's invention and lab research here at UBC. This was Professor John Grace's work on the fluidized bed membrane reactors. And so this researcher, Lee O'Donnell, who's now with Hyundai down in LA, he looked at the common process that we were trying to displace, which was steam methane reforming, hydrogen production. And he compared fluidized bed membrane reactor and looking at it as it would be if it was larger scale. So, it's sitting in the lab, but you're making assumptions and informed assumptions about what a full-scale production would look like. And so you're simulating that, if you will, through technical economic cost modeling. And he looked at, first of all, what was the production volume where there actually was a modular benefit to using this technology. So that had implications for whether it was distributed production, et cetera. And then secondly, what would you change in the research lab? What was the critical bottleneck to getting to the next stage of cost? And in this case, it was counterintuitive. It wasn't, so this is what the models look like. There's the actual financial model, the operational model, and the pieces that are scientifically limited parts of the process that you're working on in the research lab. And so he was able to say that actually this, it wasn't that you needed to necessarily replace the material in the membrane, it was that you needed to be able to have it be stronger so that the pressure differential could be higher, which was the piece that was counterintuitive to what some people were trying to make the membrane thinner, et cetera. So he was able to actually get information that could cycle back into the research program to help accelerate that the commercialization of that material and that process. Similarly, I've had students do work on fuel cell membranes and on durability and looking at process steps that can help that. And what they're all trying to focus on, and what I think is important to this research group here, is this question of, is the thing I'm doing in my research lab, is it viable? If I were able to successfully reach the goals that are right now success in my research project, could this innovation idea that I'm developing, could it be viable? And to answer that question, you have to know viable for what? You have to have been thinking about uses and about applications. And you have to be thinking about what the people that are making the decisions about those uses are actually considering. So that's what utility assessment is. The economics of production that I just spoke about on the right-hand side here, that's doing some sort of a technical economic cost model or a simulation that includes the scientific limits as well as the product decisions that need to be made and the assumptions. So is my research viable at the moment? What would it take to make it viable? And that has technical considerations, that has production and economic considerations, and that has user considerations about what utility they have for the new technological attributes you're producing. So that brings me to the second term. So we've talked now a little bit about process innovation and why that's tricky and why that can be challenging to commercialization. Let's now talk about this idea about a value chain. Now, who here has heard of a value chain? Okay. Who here is happy to, okay, there's a lot of people who haven't heard of it, so I'm going to stop there. So a value chain is something that describes the positions from the beginning of any material and products that are used in any supply chain through to the actual end consumer. And it looks at the pieces in it. You can be upstream, so very far away from the end consumer, or you can be downstream, very close to them. So here's a schematic. And when we think about advanced materials commercialization, very often the university, also the small spin-off companies, are very far upstream. Even a lot of the large multinationals, actually, if you think of a DuPont or a Dow or not quite as true in the Japanese companies who are more integrated, but a lot of other material suppliers are very high upstream in the value chains of the applications that they enable and sell into. So when you have an end consumer who's very far away from you in terms of that there's other intermediate players that you have to convince to change, to adopt a novel material, to adopt a novel process, that brings in some challenges, but also some opportunities for the kind of ways that you can make a better chance of making impact from your research. And let me talk to you with an example of how. So this is an example that I've researched in a couple of my papers. The company is called Hyperion Catalysis, based out of Boston, the first company to develop multi-wall carbon nanotubes. And it actually was financed by a very rich venture capitalist who came in, angel capitalist, sorry, who stayed in the background, who said, this is going to be the way of the future. I'm going to get some really smart people together, and we are going to, we're going to invent processes and materials that are using carbon fibers in an economical way. And so they both, several years after formation, they were able to actually develop the novel synthesis and scale it up for the carbon nanotubes. But they also found that in order to sell it, they had to have a resin mixing process as well. They had to sell that full material, not just the carbon nanotubes. And when they tried to do this, they found in their lead application, and they explored many, as we'll see in a moment, they found that in the automotive value chain, that they were very far away from their end consumer. And they were up making materials, inventions and innovations in both actually taking the raw materials, developing the multi-walled carbon nanotubes, and then mixing them and scaling up that process into a carbon fiber reinforced polymer resin. And that was the piece that they were producing. And it had a whole bunch of attributes which were radical and generic. And it was a process innovation. So they had, and they were upstream in these value chains. So what they ended up doing, as well as going to a lot of conferences, doing a lot of white papers, being an expert in that field, which we do well in universities, they also talked with people, with a commodity material supplier who was very large and had very good contacts, including to the automotive companies, and to a tier 1 automotive supplier who was making components. Actually, sorry, to a tier 3 automotive supplier who was making fuel lines. And so they worked closely with these 2 other partners in the value chain to come in with a drop-in replacement for their the automotive OEM, so the original equipment manufacturer. So that's like the Toyota or the Ford player. So they make a new model probably every 4 years. They have constraints, design constraints that they work within, and you need to be able to work and innovate within those constraints. So that's how they did that. And let me show you the timeline here. So they were founded in 1982. You can see over here. Their first product sales were 10 years later in 1992. So that's their first, and it was a drop-in replacement for fuel cell lines in one platform of a car. And the reason that they had that, they had a value proposition. They were able to save money to the automotive OEM because they didn't have to take as many forming steps as they would have had to do with a metal component. And at the same time, they were able to dissipate heat, and they were able to. They had other elements that were important for this particular application that they couldn't be done with just a normal polymer fuel line. And so they found that first drop-in application. At the same time, what the scientists were excited about and what the longer-term value of the company was actually tied up in many, many other sectors, including they had fuel cell pieces, they had electronics pieces, they had aerospace applications, and more that aren't even on this line. And so the question was, again, how do you make the early stage prioritization? How do you make sure that long term you have value that you can create and capture later on as your firm grows, and that you have currency for other partnerships? So these decisions need to be made early on, but they have huge implications for whether or not you're successful at all. Because you could think very easily during those 10 years, that's after they had their first breakthrough patent issued and they had been talking with all these different partners. In those 10 years, you could easily fold as a company, right? So you need to have a currency, if you will, and that's usually your IP strategy and what those assets are. Okay, so concluding this piece, some strategies. It's not all doom and gloom. There are lots of ways that you can accelerate advanced materials innovation, and you can do so from a very early stage while still in the research lab. First, you should utilize innovative accelerators. You have some here on campus. There are some other ones around the world. Cyclotron Road is a great example, and now Activate, so both in by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and by MIT and the Engine and some other pieces that are happening there. There are pieces that are happening here in Canada, but look and use those innovative accelerators and programs. Some of it is education. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about an opportunity with the MyTax Eye to Eye program. And there's other pieces that are available to you in this ecosystem and more broadly across Canada. But getting that sort of lens yourself on what's possible and what the potential constraints are, and then the mentoring and the networks that those can be opened up to you, including people that could be co-founders of companies if you decide to go that route. But this is important for anyone who wants to make impact from their research, whether or not you ever want to found a venture. De-risking those uncertainties. We talked about having to make those large dollar commitments before the uncertainties are resolved. You can identify and de-risk those key uncertainties systematically. And you will bring along alliance partners by that. You will be able to have a better focus in where you spend your efforts. And you will also have a way better chance of investment, not to mention getting impact from your research. And then thinking about what is your value proposition? What are the attributes that you are unique in being able to offer? What are other people that may be working on totally different technologies? What are they offering that may appeal to the same end user? And how are you different? And then what kind of alliance partners do you need in order to get to your ultimate application, which is probably way farther down the value chain? The next piece is technology market matching. This is an area that I've done a lot of my research on. It's not the same as product market fit. It's much earlier. It's a capability. It's an innovation management capability. It's an entrepreneurial capability. And it is about thinking very early stage about the decisions that you need to make early on to give yourself and the technology that you're developing a better chance of getting out into the world. So you need to be able to prioritize, and you need to be able to protect those areas which you think, maybe we'll get there in 10 years. Patent lifetime isn't forever, but there's ways of having patent families that continue. And thinking early on, what is my IP strategy? Do I need to patent, or do I have other ways of protecting? And how do I make sure that I'm thinking broadly of the different sectors in which this may have viable applications is important. Value chain positioning. I showed you something about a value chain. It may be that if you do form a company, that you actually are going to want to integrate further down, either through alliance partnerships or through actually making your business model into making a product. I gave you the case of Hyperion Catalysis. They found they couldn't just make the carbon nanotubes. They weren't going to be able to sell them in applications where they could be utilized, and they had to move further down the value chain. And then through partnership, they moved into the component manufacturer who was making those fuel lines. But it may be that instead, like Tesla and Elon Musk, you actually want to disrupt the value chains as they exist, right? You want to totally do things differently. Well, that's a different strategy, and you need to know about that early on. Because that's going to be a totally different way that you're going to spend your dollars, your alliance partnerships, your resources, and your messaging. And I mentioned about them. And the last thing is building effective alliance partnerships. I can't talk about this enough, how important it is if you want to get your research out, making the impact that you desire to have. It's not going to happen alone. So IP strategy is key to align your incentives, And there's a great piece of work by Professor Scott Stern and Professor Joshua Gahn, who are at MIT Sloan and U of T Rotman, respectively. And they talk about either building a moat, which is what you do with IP, around the technology you've developed and the products and services that you could create with that, versus storm the hill. Like, can you just execute really quickly? So in some cases, you may not need patents, right? But you need to know what that means for a whole cohesive strategy. Now, I'm looking at my timing, and I want to just very briefly touch on technology market matching, and then I'm going to jump forward to questions because I want to make sure that we get into them. I'd say that capability, which I've told you about a little bit already, is that it's a key innovation management and entrepreneurial capability for radical generic technologies, and you can do it now in the lab. It informs your experimental goals, your IP strategy, R&D strategy in a firm, partnership development, and targeted investors. It's been in the innovation literature for a long time to describe what happens within well-developed R&D facilities within large multinationals. When they're doing it really well, they're doing it like it's a pair of scissors that are smoothly aligned between the technical challenges and the market ones. I talked to you about Hyperion and the different choices they had to make early on. The same is true in researchers coming out of the university lab. Some of you may be familiar with Ionomer, which is here on campus. They spun out of the Holdcroft lab, Stephen Holdcroft's lab, chemistry at SFU. And they had to make, Ben came through the very first cohort of our I-to-I program, and the company didn't exist yet. And Stephen Holdcroft had been at the top of his game, internationally renowned for 30 years, but hadn't started a startup. And part of it was they had to make choices early on, and they had to be able to communicate that to investors. And a big part of that choice was what markets to focus on first, what alliance partners to pursue, and what message to give to your investors. And one last example of technology market matching I'm going to give to you today is up here. And this is the paper that we just published last month in Nature Nanotechnology, and it's about Epsilera and the journey of Carl Hansen and his lab to get their technology out in the world. And the point we make here is that these capabilities, these entrepreneurial capabilities in this case, that they start well before the founding of the company, which is what's shaded here. So this shaded area is from when Epsilera was founded in 2012 through to the period of time that it was incubated within the university environment here at UBC. And you can see at the top that these entrepreneurial capabilities, including technology market matching, start well before, 7 years, in fact, before founding. And that they continue through this incubation period. So this is another example to say, if you're thinking about these early, you can make a tremendous impact. It does matter for scientists and engineers to have a sense of what this opportunity can be created and to know it early on. You can't just throw it over the wall to the business people. So what if we train scientists to do this more often? We've done this from our research. We started a program back in 2015. It's now expanded with MyTax and gone across the country. We had an event last Friday, which was the national closing of this year's MyTax I-to-I cohort. It has people from universities from coast to coast. They're researchers. In one case here, it's a university professor. This is Professor Christopher Mueller from Queen's University. In other cases, they're people that have been researchers. Either they're just finishing their PhDs, such as Janice Kahn, or they've finished their PhDs a few years ago and they're researchers, but they want to make impact from their research. And this is the year before. We have people that are like Yao Yao is in advanced additive manufacturing and novel materials. Yevgen is, again, a materials person, but looking at environmental HVAC systems. And Morgan Lettinen was also an environmental and chemistry individual. So these are the kind of people who have been spending that time to get that early lens to allow them to unlock opportunity. And then one last piece that's relevant across the university, beyond the talent piece, is to say, how else do we smooth the path at universities to allow for those who do want to start a venture to allow them to have all the ingredients for success. And I call that build for scale. And we have a proposal around build for scale clean tech, which is about thinking about what can we do within a university environment funded from the government that is aligning the incentives of people like you, science and engineering researchers and faculty, with the needs of the innovation ecosystem. And some of that is de-risking technology and prototype vouchers. Some of that is living lab type things, which there's some amazing ones going on here at the university, including Walter Morita's hydrogen pieces, which are fantastic. But we want to more systematically do that across faculties, and we want to think about commercialization strategy and how that's funded. In this proposal, we've been working with E at UBC and talking about, and also at UVic, at the Coast Capital Innovation Center, and talking about how do we better resource those interstitial zones between the research and getting it out to impact, and then thinking about how do we use our core facilities better and resource them in line with these inventors. So there's an op-ed there that might be interesting to some of you that I wrote about this last year. So that's it. There's clearly lots more, but I want to give time for some questions and some discussion, and be happy to continue the conversation with people that are interested. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elicia. Super, super nice. Time for questions. I think there is plenty of opportunity here. It's great to learn. And I'm sure many of you may have many questions. Maybe I can start with one, what you think about some.
Sure.
In slide number 19.
Yeah, sure.
You have several considerations that are very important. In our space, I was wondering if we can add one additional layer.
This one here? Or no?
19.
I'm not sure.
No, it was not there. You have the slide numbers.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe it was before, so if you go back, yeah, I'll share with you. Yeah, that one.
This one, the availability? Oh, yeah. Oh, this one? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
okay.
Technical. Maybe we can add a leg here, probably, is the environmental impact.
Yes.
And those aspects, that's for us, is very important.
Absolutely.
Can we quantify that in some way?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic. So I would say you could put that into utility assessment, but you could also put that in separately. So when you think of a value metric, it can be a multi-attribute utility assessment, and environmental should absolutely be in that. But I think it may be that you have something that is quantifiable, like GHG emissions reductions, or it might be something that is more qualitative, right? But is or it might be how many tons you've displaced from landfills or something. So I totally agree that should be part of your value metric.
That's coming very strong, probably. I saw Richard Hans in the back, and then Johan.
Elicia, thank you very much for talking. And of course, thank you for all the work that you've been doing. It's spot on from my own personal experience. I guess the question I wanted to ask you was around from your own process of working with researchers. How do you help them, or how do we help them kind of get to know what they need to know in order to be able to do what we're talking about?
Yep.
And I don't know if the question's making sense, but for me, I completely resonate with everything you're saying because I've been there. I've lived through it. I startup. I totally get what you're talking about.
Yep.
But there's lots of people that haven't been there. They don't
Yes.
have that experience. So how do they know what they don't know? How do we help them get to know?
So that's a fantastic question, and I'm going to deflect it to Professor Feng Jiang and also to Dr. Finlay McNabb to say, why did you come and join the Eye-to-Eye program? Well, what was it that gave you the motivation to do that? And then how do you think we could better help other people to have the desire to take that step? Yeah, Finlay, you're first.
Hey, yeah, I'm Finlay. I was in the first cohort of the Eye-to-Eye program, which is where Professor Maine teaches everybody all this stuff. And I took the course because I'm a mature student. I also worked for 3 startups as a researcher for 15 years. And, when I started doing startup research, I was so excited because, unlike the lab work, you spend millions of dollars and you do great work so fast. And you're like, I can't believe I have done this. You look at your work and you're so proud of it. And then after 5 years of 80-hour weeks, you lose your job or your project is canceled. And And that happened to be 3 times, right, in 15 years. And eventually I got burned out and I went back to do my PhD at SFU. And I saw the program and I was like, maybe this will teach me why I lost my job so many times. And that's actually what happened. Learning about these techniques gives a scientist like a new framework to understand the viability of the work they're doing. You can be working on million-dollar projects that seem spectacular, but they're actually a waste of your time. And understanding the viability that is encompassed in this slide takes a long time, takes like a year of work, but once you do it, you will be able to apply your skills way more effectively. And I think that is the reason why I'm here to support Professor Maine today, and it's why I love the I2I program. And I think it'd be good for anyone here.
Just before, Feng, before you comment, I wanted to mention too that that Finley has been, the skill set that you developed has done a couple of things, right? Because you might want to speak about the Ignite panel and why that skill set is valuable, but also something that we didn't mention is in that particular program, you're always applying the ideas to your own technology, right? It's very much applied, concept, but applied. But do you want to talk about Ignite?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, the whole program has done great things for me. Like, number one, I sat down next to Ben Britton on the first day of the program and got to invest in Ionware at a very early stage. So, you know, that's great. But also, through the networking and skills I learned on the business side, I was able to join the Innovate BC Ignite panel, which is a grant education panel. We've distributed like $9 million at this point to academic industrial partnerships, and the experiences allow me to differentiate between the I2I training allows me to tell which projects have legs, which projects are going to move forward, and it's allowed me to I think really support innovation in BC. And one thing that I'll mention about my work with the Ignite panel is that I get reams of proposals, right? Reams of proposals. And I have to read them all. And the technical side of these proposals is often compelling. You know, as a scientist, I love it. But the business side of these proposals is so poorly written that it wouldn't even get you a B+ in Finance 101, right? So incredibly smart people who haven't leveraged their knowledge to reimagine to find out the viability of their ideas. And that's why, you know, when you're looking to get translational grants, which is a big part of granting in Canada these days, that you need to be aware of the business side. And no matter how good your idea is, if it's not modeled in the right way, it will not get you where you want to go.
Thanks, Finley. And I think that translational grant piece works well into your world, Feng. Is that true?
Yeah, okay. I think, thank you. So I will say something. I was in 2019 and 2020, so I was so far, so I was fortunate to have the opportunity to get my head company and attend the program. The program actually, I started in 2018, so I was doing bio-based research, like most of you here. So I was start building my lab 2018 and trying to figure out what I need to do as an independent researcher. Before I was always working for others. Right now I have my authority to do my own research. What kind of research I want to do and what kind of impact I want to give. So actually my colleague Scott forwarded me the email, I think from Stephen Hannah. Professor Stephen Hannah was previous to
Yes, yes.
So Scott forwarded me this email saying, okay, so this is our opportunity, so to see whether you want to attend. I contacted Elicia and then got an opportunity. So what I want to say is, basically I think it's a very good opportunity for me to attend there to learn all the technical part and to define the project. And also it's regarding the translational grant, as Elicia was mentioning. So I was with the help from the cellulose biomaterial and also for thermal insulation. So that was founded mostly to do some market assessment. And then right now we are also working phase one eye to eye. So we already submitted phase one, so not sure the result yet. But what I want to say is through the program, I really, before I never considered myself to be an entrepreneurship or to start a company. But right now, whenever I do research, I also ask my students, so what is a product, right? So just like you mentioned, so you have a technology, and then you want to define one field you want to go in there. And from there, you can expand further, but I very clearly you need to go to a particular field. You need to do the market assessment to see whether your technology fits in there. So this is what I'm doing right now. Although we don't have any commercial product right now, but most of the technology I see there's some potential to be commercialized. And also we also go with the UIO for the patent application, provisional patent application. So when I was first in the program to go there, so we were applying for one provisional. So right now we are applying for more of the provisional. So not sure the provisional always go through the final patent application, but this is more like the testing the idea and more like to reach out to the company to see we have this technology they want to do co-develop or maybe the student want to spin off. So yeah, I highly recommend this program. So I think I recommend all of my postdocs to attending this program the following year. Not always do research, but always thinking about the potential impact, right? So I think this is highly recommended program. I'm glad to see it's a final the MyTech collaboration, the MyTech UI. So I think that's a very good opportunity for everyone here who want to see what you are doing in a lab can go to the market, right? So I know all people here working on bio-based products. We know there's a huge value in there. Right now there's not so many, especially in Canada, there's not so many bio-products on the market. I think this is we're happy to have you here to talk to us, to introduce the technology and also the program. I would highly recommend everyone to, if you have an opportunity to attend this program.
Thank you very much, Feng.
I think you will have a lot of students now.
Great.
Thank you very much for the talk. This is almost what we touched on earlier.
Yes.
Some
Yep.
of my students have gone through the UBC lab launch.
Yep.
Can you position this?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that the Hatch program that comes
Yep.
after that?
Yep.
Where did all these lie?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there's some great resources here. When I talked about, looking for innovative accelerators, you have some great resources right here on campus. Lab to Launch, the venture studios that are being built up here, the Hatch pieces. There's a lot of good support. And then for some of you going into the Creative Destruction Lab, Climate Ventures could be an option later on. And so there's a great ecosystem. But this is before those. And sometimes people go in a different direction. They do Lab to Launch first, or they do, they do the customer discovery program, UBC program first, and then they come back and say, there's some other considerations. I think there might be more opportunity in a different place than what we did our interviews in. And this is early stage, as you saw in the slide that shows Carl Hansen's lab. Right here. Is it here or is it after that? Yeah, I think it's here. I just want to show it again. Yeah, so here you can see that the technology market matching starts happening well before there's a venture, right? It happens in the research lab. So this is not product market fit, which is what really is happening in the customer discovery interviews that happen with a lot of the UBC programs. And other programs, lab to market programs elsewhere, and I-Corps in the States. This is before that. This is shaping the opportunity itself. It's shaping the science. It's shaping the individual's mindset so that, we're teaching you to fish rather than fishing for you, and you're applying it all to your own innovation idea. But it's very early stage, and it's thinking about, there's something in the entrepreneurship literature that distinguishes between opportunity recognition, so recognizing opportunities that already exist, versus creating new ones. And as scientists, especially with breakthrough research, you are in a position to actually create new opportunities that don't exist. And in some accelerators and in some business programs, they'll hammer you down and say, oh, that's technology push. Oh, there's no market for that. But they did the same with, the first personal computer. This is anything that is brand new, the first transistor, anything that's brand new, you're going to be told, well, you look at Peter Cullis and his journey with lipid nanoparticles. I mean, people will tell you, no, there is no opportunity for this. And what I would say is that if you have something breakthrough that can create value, it's a dance. That technology market matching capability is an iterative process to both explore at an early stage, help you make decisions and guide you, and also with your IP strategy, with some of the experimentation that you do, to the point that you made, Feng, about how you're guiding your graduate students and saying, okay, if that was successful, what would that be achieving? What user need does that mean? Some of the greatest scientist entrepreneurs in the world do exactly that. And it's not always about starting a startup. It can be creating impact in a variety of ways. So I would say that this is complementary to what exists in this ecosystem. And then that MyTax eye-to-eye cohort that goes across the country that MyTax pays for, it is an opportunity to interact with researchers in similar areas across the country and the mentor groups that are helping support them. So there's that aspect to it as well.
If I may, just a quick question related to this, Elicia, is, so far we're talking about very conventional materials, but when it comes to bio-based materials and BioProducts, we see a little bit of an externality, a challenge outside that prevents adoption.
Absolutely.
Despite all the merits.
Yep.
So what is that we need to overcome to introduce BioProducts in the market and to have this spin off the web?
So it's understanding who, in the first instance, has the value to adopt that. It's really understanding better, in that viability slide, it's understanding better the, I don't even know where that slide is, but I think it's right here. There it is. So it's understanding better this utility assessment, right? Because if you understand that better, there are markets right now that will take bioplastics. And it's scaling that and staging that to find the first, and it's got to be a drop-in replacement. It's got to be easy. So I was a paid consultant to, requested consultant to IDEO and their next-gen plastics challenge, which has a lot of bio-based materials in it. And then I realized I don't have time for this after that. It was a friend who had asked me, but I got to mentor about 6 companies that were all looking at compostable materials and this challenge was sponsored by Starbucks and McDonald's, right? So it was for cups and it was for, in particular. And I saw some great technologies and many people that were aiming for the horizon as opposed to for the intermediate application. And so I think all of these concepts can be applied, and what it really is understanding utility assessment and understanding the first market that will get you, that's not your dream market, it's not what the value that, it's not what gets you out of bed in the morning, but it's going to get the foothold in that will allow the other regulatory challenges, etc.
And if I may, before we go to Scott, a question maybe that many students may have. We have very cool research, and we want to publish.
Yes.
So when to publish and when not to publish?
Yes.
That's something that maybe we are asking ourselves all the time.
Yes. Well, this is something to talk with your UILO about, for sure. But I would say that there's a lot that can be published that doesn't give away from patents, or that you can file a provisional, right, which gives you that year, and that you can file that provisional also corresponding with the publication. So one of the scientist entrepreneurs that I've studied, Professor Bob Langer, who's at MIT, and so my group did a 6-year labor of love study of his lab, of the papers, the publications, and the ventures, and how they matched. And you saw a pattern that those papers and publications always came out at the same time, right? And they were based off each other, and that first provisional was something that was just tightly linked. So I would say talk to the UILO, but also don't let it stop you from publishing, but get your IP strategy together at the same time. Yeah.
Scott, and then Michael.
Yeah.
So the various discussion today, I'm curious in terms of, you talk about innovation for technology and materials, innovation for processes.
Yep.
But I'm wondering about the impact of
Yes.
instead of just the old buy low, sell high?
You should come join the Eye to Eye, because on that, which I couldn't talk about today, but what is the question?
Well, just in general, like, are there resources for scientists to kind of understand how to kind of think outside the box in terms of moving technologies forward, but not in the same kind of...
Absolutely. Finley, do you want to take that one?
I mean, I think that essentially the whole I2I program is like business is actually a science, and we are great scientists. We know how to model, hypothesize, test the model, redo the model, and when you learn the art and practice of business, there's only a slight change in perspective to be able to do exactly what you say, build a business model. It's based on existing knowledge of business. You build your business model, you have a hypothesis of how it will go, you test it. And if it doesn't work, you immediately change course.
Yeah.
So it's like a scientist's, it's like a business course for scientists. And it allows you to reframe what you already do really well towards all the questions that you might have around how do you make a successful business. And Professor Maine has done case studies on like so many successful and unsuccessful businesses that you really learn to build those models effectively. And that's what it's all about.
And you know, other colleagues in the programs too, both practitioners and academics that are part of the program. But hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Interesting talk.
Thank you.
Comment on this trade secret and IP.
Yeah.
When you decide, and are more companies going the trade secret route so they can hide their invention and not disclosing it?
So what's interesting, together with a professor, Anush Prasartip, and we've co-supervised a couple of students. He's had a couple of students through the Eye to Eye. One who went on to use that in her PhD thesis, but another who did a survey of manufacturers across Canada looking at their IP. So he used the Composites Research Network and the Composites Knowledge Network to have a basis of people, but then extended it across our Quebec colleagues to look at their IP strategies. And I would say for manufacturing firms, which was the group that we were looking at, that there is shocking lack of patents used in Canadian companies. And I say shocking because it can often be the currency for which you make that you reserve value for a differentiated product and or in a partnership. We found that there was companies that were sort of in the 100-person size, had a lot of patents that they used. Now, what were the smaller companies using? Because we looked at those under 10 employees and those under 20 as well, and those under 100. And we found that they were using trade secrets, often successfully, but they were using it because the cost of the patents, because they didn't have somebody familiar on site, and because they were worried that actually when it gets published, that larger players were going to patent around them anyway and just muscle them out, or were going to muscle them out anyway, right? And that they didn't have the pockets to defend their IP, which is reasonable. I do know that NGen, the supercluster, the manufacturing supercluster, led out of Ontario but national, that they're working hard on working with such firms with their IP strategy, and that there are a few programs that are trying to make that easier to do. So certainly there was, if you want to look further at any of that data, Cheyenne Fahimi is the PhD student who has it. But I would say that there are very good strategies to use trade secrets as long as you don't need to partner with a large firm. Because if you're partnering with a large firm and you're using a trade secret, yeah, I think you lose a lot of leverage.
Maybe one final comment or question. You see here there is a row of professors and there is the students, and in your figure there you have actually many students.
Yes.
PhD students and postdocs.
Yes.
Probably.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, what is the most effective way that you have found as far as professors and students? What is the role of each of those groups?
What is the what? Sorry?
What is the role, or rather, what is the best way to come to impact in that synergy between professors and students? How does it work? What is the best way?
Oh, you mean if they want to start a venture, or if
Yeah.
if they want to create impact in any way? So I think the grad students and the postdocs are a huge piece of creating impact. I think that they're, because of the scarcity of academic jobs across the country, we have so many highly qualified and really, really smart individuals who want to go into industry, but we don't have research labs in large multinationals here in Canada. They want to stay in Vancouver or in Canada, and there's a few other paths that can make your next step more valuable and allow you to carry on that research expertise, but also do it in a way that is meaningful, rewarding. And I'll give an example. This morning I saw on LinkedIn, because that's one of the places that's where I do my social media. I don't do Twitter, but I do LinkedIn. And I saw that the CEO of Terramera, Carl Marnhaas, he said he was doing a Q&A with one of his senior VP of R&D and the head of green chemistry, Matthew DeHabier, who's an alumni from here, who is also an alumni from the IDI. He was in your year. And the CEO said, wow, our senior VP, he has this remarkable vision. He can actually translate between business and engineering. His leadership qualities are, but his integrative capacities are amazing. And, and I was thinking to myself, yes, he's a remarkable individual, and he is totally on his own right. But it's having that second lens that allows you to walk in both worlds. It allows you to be a really effective leader. It allows you to know what keeps the CEO of your company up awake at night, and it allows you to create new opportunities. So I would say that path towards being an innovation champion in industry is a really important path for our HQP. And we're doing a disservice to our PhDs and postdocs if we don't help them create those leadership opportunities.
Yeah, that's the message I wanted to hear. I think that's a very strong message to the students.